The rain began just after 3 in the morning, a soft persistent tapping against the window pane that pulled Elena from a dream she couldn't quite remember. She lay still in the darkness, listening to the rhythm of it, feeling the weight of the coming day settle on her chest like a physical presence. 47 years old, 17 of them spent as a Child Protective Services investigator, and still some mornings arrived with this particular heaviness, the kind that wasn't about fatigue or even dread, but about the quiet understanding that today might be the day she would have to break someone's world apart in order to possibly save it. She rose slowly, the floorboards cool beneath her bare feet, and moved through the silent apartment toward the kitchen. No lights yet. She preferred the blue-gray pre-dawn gloom, the way it softened edges and made the world feel suspended between what had been and what was yet to come. The coffee maker gurgled to life, its familiar sounds a small anchor in the uncertainty that always accompanied her work. She stood at the sink watching raindrops chase each other down the glass, each one following its own crooked path yet all heading toward the same destination. The ground, the gutter, the storm drain that would carry them away from this quiet street in a modest neighborhood where people kept their blinds drawn and their problems private. Elena had learned early in her career that suffering rarely announces itself with sirens and spectacle. It prefers the ordinary hour, the unremarkable Tuesday, the child who stops making eye contact not because of trauma witnessed but because of trauma endured in the slow, grinding way that leaves no visible bruises but hollows out the spirit from within. She thought of the file waiting for her on the passenger seat of her sedan parked below, a file containing photographs of a 7-year-old boy named Matteo whose school nurse had documented concerning patterns of absence, a withdrawn demeanor that had shifted from shy to nearly catatonic over 3 months, and most troublingly, a single sentence in the teacher's notes. He flinches when adults raise their voices even in excitement. Not the dramatic flinch of someone expecting a blow, but something more insidious. The preemptive shrinking of a child who has learned that adult energy in any form precedes pain. Elena had seen enough to know that sometimes the absence of evidence was itself the most damning evidence of all. The mother, Anya Sharma, had no criminal record, no prior CPS involvement, held a steady job as a medical transcriptionist working overnight shifts. The father had left before Matteo was born. On paper, a struggling but functional single-parent household. But paper was a liar. Paper couldn't capture the quality of silence in a home where a child had learned that speaking might make things worse. Paper couldn't measure the weight of a mother's exhaustion when it crossed the threshold from tiredness into something darker, something that made her see her own child not as a person to nurture but as an obstacle between her and the sleep she desperately needed. Elena had interviewed Anya once before, 6 months ago, after a different teacher had raised concerns about Matteo coming to school with mismatched clothes and the lingering scent of cigarette smoke though Anya didn't smoke. That visit had been unremarkable, Anya polite but guarded, the apartment clean if sparse, Matteo quiet but responsive when spoken to directly. Elena had closed the case with a referral to a free parenting support group, a decision that had felt right at the time. Now she wondered if she had mistaken survival for stability, if she had seen a mother doing her best when in truth she had been witnessing the slow erosion of a woman's capacity to care for anyone including herself. The coffee finished brewing. Elena poured a cup, the steam warming her face. She thought about calling her supervisor to discuss the new allegations before making the home visit, but something held her back, not protocol or ego, but a deeper intuition that had been honed through years of navigating the gray spaces where policy manuals offered little guidance. This wasn't about checking boxes on a form. This was about standing in a living room with a woman who might be at her breaking point and a child who might already be broken, and making a judgment call that would echo through their lives for decades to come. Remove the child and risk destroying a family that might recover with support. Leave him and risk returning to find bruises that weren't there before, or worse, a child who had learned to stop flinching altogether because he'd stopped expecting kindness. There was no safe choice. Only choices with different kinds of consequences. She dressed carefully, jeans, a soft sweater the color of sage, flat shoes. Nothing that looked like an authority uniform. She wanted to appear as human as possible when she knocked on that door, because the moment a mother perceived her as a threat, the truth would retreat behind walls of defensiveness and fear. She drove through streets still glistening with rain, the city waking slowly around her. Office workers with umbrellas, delivery trucks double-parked, the smell of wet pavement and exhaust mixing in the cool morning air. She thought about her own childhood, growing up in a household where anger was a constant weather system, where her father's moods determined whether dinner would be peaceful or punctuated by slammed doors and shouted accusations. She had become a protector of children not despite that history but because of it. The girl who had hidden in her closet with a flashlight and library books had grown into a woman determined to be the adult she'd needed back then. But 17 years in this work had taught her a difficult truth. Sometimes the adult a child needs most is the one willing to make them temporarily unhappy in order to secure their long-term safety. Sometimes love looks like loss. She parked half a block from the Sharma apartment building, a 3-story brick structure with small balconies and potted plants that suggested residents trying to cultivate beauty in limited spaces. She sat for a moment with her hands on the steering wheel, breathing slowly, centering herself. This wasn't about her history. It was about Mateo's present. She gathered her bag, notebook, camera, resource pamphlets that might or might not be needed depending on how the visit unfolded, and walked toward the building, her footsteps quiet on the wet sidewalk. Apartment 2B. She knocked gently at first, then with slightly more presence when no answer came. Through the door she heard the faint sound of a television left on too loud, the tinny voices of a morning talk show. After a full minute, footsteps approached from inside, slow and heavy. The door opened just enough for a chain lock to hold it fast. One eye appeared in the gap, dark brown, bloodshot, surrounded by shadows that spoke of many sleepless nights. Anya Sharma. She looked older than her 34 years, her black hair pulled into a messy bun with strands escaping around a face that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. Now it was a landscape of exhaustion, the kind that settles deep in the bones and changes the very architecture of a person's expression. Miss Sharma? I'm Elena Vasquez from Child Protective Services. We spoke on the phone yesterday about visiting with Mateo. The eye blinked slowly. I remember. Pause. The television continued its chatter behind her. He's still sleeping. I understand it's early. I can come back later if this isn't a good time. Another long pause. Elena waited without shifting her weight, without checking her watch, without any gesture that might communicate impatience. She had learned that time moved differently in homes where anxiety lived. It stretched and compressed in unpredictable ways, and rushing someone already drowning in it only made them sink faster. The chain rattled as it was unhooked. The door opened fully. Anya stood barefoot in faded sweatpants and an oversized t-shirt, arms crossed tightly over her chest as if holding herself together. The apartment beyond was dim, curtains drawn against the morning light. The television blared from the living room, a celebrity chef demonstrating a complicated sauce. Can we turn that down? Elena asked softly. Anya nodded, shuffled to the couch, and muted the television with a remote that had food stains on its buttons. The sudden silence felt heavier than the noise had been. Elena stepped inside, closing the door behind her but not latching it, a small gesture of respect, an unspoken promise that she wasn't trapping anyone here. Where's Mateo sleeping? She asked. His room. Down the hall, last door on the left. Anya's voice was flat, devoid of the musicality Elena had heard during their phone conversation 2 days ago. Something had shifted in the intervening hours. Or perhaps the phone call had been the performance and this hollowed-out version was the reality. I'd like to speak with him when he wakes up. In the meantime, would you mind if I looked around the apartment? It's standard procedure. Anya shrugged, a gesture so minimal it was almost invisible. Whatever. Elena moved slowly through the small living space. Clean enough, though dishes sat in the sink and laundry baskets overflowed in corners. No visible hazards, electrical cords tucked away, no broken glass, medications presumably stored out of reach though she'd need to verify. The kitchen counters held evidence of takeout containers and instant coffee packets. A single place setting at the small table for two. She noted the absence of children's artwork on the refrigerator, the lack of toys in the living room beyond a worn stuffed bear sitting alone on the couch cushion. Not definitive signs of neglect. Some parents preferred minimalist homes, but combined with the teacher's observations, they formed a pattern worth noting. She moved down the short hallway toward Mateo's room. The door was closed. She knocked softly. Mateo? It's Ms. Elena. Your mom said I could say hello when you wake up. No response. She waited 10 seconds, then gently pushed the door open. The room was dark, curtains drawn tight. A small figure lay beneath a blue comforter, facing the wall. Elena approached slowly, her footsteps silent on the carpet. Hey there, she whispered, sitting on the edge of the bed. I know it's early. You can keep your eyes closed if you want. I just wanted to say hi. The lump beneath the covers didn't move. She waited another minute, watching the slow rise and fall of his breathing. Then, almost imperceptibly, his shoulders tensed. He was awake. He had been awake the entire time. Your teacher Miss Alvarez says you're really good at drawing dragons, Elena continued in the same soft tone. She showed me one you made last month with purple scales and green fire coming out of its mouth. That's a cool combination. A tiny shift beneath the covers. Not a response, but not complete withdrawal either. Progress. I brought some paper and colored pencils in my bag. If you want to draw while we talk, that's fine. Or we can just sit quietly for a while. No pressure. She remained seated on the edge of the bed for 3 full minutes, saying nothing more, simply existing in his space without demanding anything from him. This was often the most important part of her work, not the interrogation or the assessment, but the patient offering of presence. Children who had learned that adults took time, energy, compliance, silence, often needed to experience an adult who simply gave attention without expectation, gave space without judgment, gave the radical gift of waiting. Finally, so faint she almost missed it, a whisper. The fire was blue. Elena smiled, though he couldn't see it with his back still turned. Blue fire. Even cooler. Hotter than green, right? A barely perceptible nod against the pillow. Can I sit here a little longer? Another nod. She stayed for 10 more minutes, occasionally making quiet observations about nothing important. The weather, a bird she'd seen on her drive over, the interesting pattern of cracks on his ceiling that looked like a map of somewhere undiscovered. She didn't ask questions about his mother, about his home life, about why he might be afraid. Not yet. First, safety. First, the establishment of a fragile trust that could be shattered by a single misstep. When she finally rose to leave the room, she paused at the doorway. I'll be in the living room with your mom if you want to come out later. The colored pencils are on the kitchen table. Back in the living room, Anya sat exactly where Elena had left her, arms still crossed, staring at the muted television screen as if it held answers to questions she hadn't yet learned how to ask. He's a quiet kid, Elena said, taking a seat in the armchair opposite the couch rather than beside her, a non-threatening positioning that left physical space between them. He's always been quiet, Anya replied, her voice still flat. Not like other kids. Doesn't make a lot of noise. Quiet isn't a problem. Withdrawn can be. There's a difference. Anya's arms tightened across her chest. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm here because people who care about Matteo noticed changes in him recently. Not that he's quiet, that he's become quieter. That he flinches. That he stopped participating in class. That he comes to school sometimes looking like he hasn't slept. I work nights. He stays with my sister sometimes. Sometimes he's here alone. He knows the rules. The defensiveness was rising now, predictable as tide. Elena had heard this script before. The justification wrapped in practicality, the implication that the child's behavior was a choice rather than a response. 7-year-olds shouldn't be alone overnight, Anya. That's not a judgment of you as a mother. It's a statement of fact about what 7-year-olds need developmentally. I don't have a choice. My sister can't always take him. The overnight shifts pay more. I need the money. I understand. Truly. I've sat with many mothers in this exact situation. The question isn't whether you're trying your best with limited resources. The question is whether Matteo is safe and thriving right now. He's fine. The words came out sharp, brittle. He eats. He goes to school. He has clothes. What more do you want? I want to understand what happens when you come home from work at 7 in the morning exhausted and he's been alone all night and needs things from you. Breakfast, help with homework he couldn't do alone, comfort because he was scared in the dark, and you have nothing left to give. Anya's face crumpled then just for a second before she forced it back into that flat mask. But Elena had seen it, the crack in the armor where the truth lived. The shame. The exhaustion. The terrible awareness that she was failing the one person who depended on her completely. He doesn't ask for much, Anya whispered, staring at her hands now. He knows I'm tired. He tries to be good. The words hung in the dim room, devastating in their simplicity. A child who had learned to minimize his own needs to accommodate his mother's limitations. This wasn't active abuse, the kind that left marks and required immediate removal. This was the slower, more insidious erosion of a child's right to be a child, to need things, to make noise, to take up space in the world. And it was happening not because Anya was evil or even particularly negligent by societal standards that often excused maternal exhaustion as inevitable, but because she was drowning and had no lifeline in sight. Elena made a decision then, not the final decision about Matteo's placement, but a decision about how to proceed in this moment. She could cite regulations, threaten consequences, push for immediate removal given the overnight alone time. It would be justified. It would also likely destroy any chance of building the trust necessary to help this family heal. Or she could offer a different path, one that acknowledged Anya's struggle while being absolutely clear about Mateo's needs. "Anya," she said gently, "I'm not here to take your son away today, but I am here to tell you honestly that the situation as it stands isn't sustainable for him. Children his age need consistent adult presence, especially at night. They need to feel that someone capable is watching over them while they sleep. That's not a luxury, it's a foundational requirement for healthy development." Tears welled in Anya's eyes but didn't fall, pride holding them back. "I have resources," Elena continued. "A temporary emergency childcare program that provides overnight care for children of parents working non-traditional hours. It's not foster care, it's a supervised home-like setting where Mateo would sleep in his own bed, have dinner with other kids, get help with homework. You'd pick him up each morning after your shift ends. It's meant to be a bridge while we work on longer-term solutions." Anya shook her head slowly. "I can't afford that. It's free for families in your situation. Fully funded. No cost to you. I don't want strangers taking care of my son. He'd still be yours completely. You'd see him every day. This isn't about replacing you as his mother. It's about supplementing your capacity during the hours when you're physically unable to be present because you're working to provide for him. There's no shame in needing support." The word shame seemed to strike a chord. Anya looked away toward Mateo's closed bedroom door down the hall. "What if I say no?" she asked quietly. "Then I have to make a report documenting that a 7-year-old is regularly left alone overnight. That would trigger a more formal investigation, possibly involving law enforcement depending on how the district attorney's office interprets the neglect statutes. It could result in temporary removal while the case is adjudicated. Or it could result in mandated services with less flexibility than what I'm offering voluntarily today. The outcome becomes less certain the more formal the process becomes." Elena hated delivering these ultimatums, but honesty was the only currency that mattered here. Sugarcoating reality helped no one, least of all Mateo. Anya was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on that closed door as if she could see through it to the small boy lying motionless in his bed, listening to every word. Elena wondered if he was truly asleep now or if he was lying there with his eyes wide open in the darkness, absorbing the conversation that would determine whether he spent tonight in his own bed or somewhere else, whether his mother would be there when he woke or whether he'd face another morning alone. Finally, Anya spoke, her voice barely audible. "He gets scared of the dark." "I know," Elena said softly. "I leave the hallway light on. And the bathroom light. So it's not completely dark. That's thoughtful of you. But he still gets scared. He came out last week and stood outside my bedroom door for 20 minutes before I heard him. I was so tired I didn't hear him right away. When I finally opened the door he was just standing there crying silently. Not making a sound. Just tears rolling down his face." Anya's own tears finally fell then, tracing paths through the exhaustion on her face. "I held him and told him it was okay, but I was so angry too. Angry that he needed me when I had nothing left to give. And then I felt terrible for feeling angry. It's a cycle. I can't get out of it." Elena nodded. This was the truth she had been waiting for, not the defensive posturing, not the justifications, but the raw, unvarnished reality of maternal burnout compounded by isolation and lack of support. This was where intervention could actually take root. "What if," Elena said carefully, "we tried the emergency overnight care for just 3 nights this week? A trial run. You'd pick him up each morning at 7:30. You'd have your evenings with him as usual. You'd get uninterrupted sleep after your shift. And Mateo would have consistent adult supervision overnight. After 3 nights we'd talk again, just you and me, and decide whether to continue, adjust, or explore other options. No permanent decisions today. Just a chance to break the cycle for a few days and see how it feels for both of you." Anya wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. "He'll think I'm abandoning him. Then we'll explain it together. We'll tell him the truth, that mommy has to work while other mommies sleep, and that means sometimes she's too tired to be the kind of mommy he needs at night. And that there are kind people who can help during those hours so that mommy can be more present during the day. Children understand more than we give them credit for when we speak to them honestly." Another long silence. Elena waited, resisting the urge to fill the space with reassuring words. This decision had to be Anya's. Coerced compliance would collapse the moment oversight ended. Real change required genuine buy-in, however fragile. "I need to talk to him first," Anya said finally. "Of course. I need to see if he'll even agree to go." "He doesn't have legal veto power over safety decisions," Elena said gently but firmly. "But his feelings matter enormously. And a transition that respects his emotional reality will be far more successful than one forced upon him. So yes, let's talk to him together. Right now if you're ready. Anya rose slowly from the couch, her movements heavy with fatigue and fear. She walked down the hall to Mateo's room, Elena following a respectful distance behind. Anya paused outside the door, took a deep breath that seemed to cost her great effort, then pushed it open. The room was still dark. Mateo hadn't moved from his position facing the wall. "Sweetheart," Anya said, her voice transformed, softer, warmer, stripped of the defensiveness she'd worn like armor in the living room. "Ms. Elena and I were talking. There's a place you could stay some nights where there are other kids and grown-ups who make dinner and help with homework. You'd come home every morning to me. Would you like to hear about it?" No response. But Elena noticed that Mateo's shoulders had relaxed slightly. He was listening. Anya sat on the edge of the bed where Elena had been sitting earlier. "I know you get scared at night when I'm sleeping. And I'm so sorry I can't always wake up when you need me. This wouldn't be forever. Just some nights. And I'd pick you up every single morning. You'd see me every day." A tiny movement beneath the covers, Mateo shifting just enough to peek at his mother from beneath the comforter. His eyes were wide, dark pools of uncertainty and longing. "Would it be like camp?" he whispered. "Not exactly. More like a house with other kids. You'd have your own bed. They have blueberry pancakes on Tuesdays." A flicker of something in his eyes. Interest? Oh, it was hard to tell. "Could I bring Mr. Snuggles?" he asked, referring to the worn stuffed bear Elena had noticed on the couch. "Of course you could bring Mr. Snuggles," Anya said, her voice thick with emotion she was fighting to control. "He'd have his own special spot on your new bed." Mateo was silent for a long moment, processing. Then, so quietly Elena almost missed it, "Will you still read me a story before I go?" Anya's composure broke completely then. She leaned down and pressed her forehead against her son's, tears falling freely onto his pillow. "Every night. I'll read you 2 stories if you want. I promise." Elena watched this exchange with the professional detachment she'd cultivated over years of witnessing intimate family moments, but beneath that detachment, her heart ached with the simple tragedy of it all. A mother and son both trying so hard to love each other across the chasm of exhaustion and fear. This wasn't a story of villains and victims. It was a story of human limitation meeting human need, and the painful gap between what we intend and what we're capable of delivering when resources, emotional, financial, communal, run dry. After a few minutes of quiet murmuring between mother and son, Anya rose and walked back to the living room, wiping her face. Elena followed. "He'll try it," Anya said, her voice steadier now. 3 nights. We'll see." Elena nodded. "I'll make the arrangements today. Someone will call you this afternoon with details, where to bring him, what to pack, the name of the caregiver he'll meet. I'll come by tomorrow evening to check in, see how the first day went." "Thank you," Anya whispered, the words seeming to cost her something precious. Elena almost said "you're welcome," but stopped herself. This wasn't about gratitude. It was about necessity. Instead she simply said, "We'll take it one day at a time." She left the apartment, closing the door softly behind her. In the hallway she leaned against the wall for a moment, breathing deeply. The immediate crisis had been averted, not resolved, not healed, but momentarily stabilized. Mateo would be safe tonight. Anya would get sleep. Tomorrow they would face tomorrow's challenges. This was the nature of her work. Rarely dramatic rescues, mostly small interventions that created breathing room for families to find their footing again. But as she walked down the hallway toward the stairwell, a disquiet settled over her. She had made what felt like the right decision in the moment, offering support rather than punishment, building trust rather than wielding authority. Yet something nagged at the edges of her awareness, a faint dissonance she couldn't quite name. She replayed the visit in her mind, the too quiet apartment, the child who had been awake and listening the entire time, the mother's exhaustion that seemed to go deeper than sleep deprivation alone could explain. There was a quality to Anya's despair that felt familiar to Elena in a way that unsettled her. Not the familiar pattern of a struggling single mother, but something more specific, more intimate. She reached her car and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. Rain had begun falling again, soft drops pattering against the windshield. She closed her eyes and let the memory surface. The way Anya's arms had been crossed so tightly over her chest, the flatness in her voice that wasn't just fatigue but something closer to dissociation. The way she described feeling angry at her son for needing her when she had nothing left to give. Elena knew that particular cocktail of emotions not just from her caseload but from her own life. From the year after her husband had left, when her daughter Sophia was 8 years old and Elena had been working 60-hour weeks while grieving a marriage she'd believed would last forever. She remembered snapping at Sophia for asking simple questions. "What's for dinner? Can you help me with my spelling words? Will you read me a story?" Because each request felt like a demand she couldn't meet, each need a reminder of her own failure to provide the stable home she'd promised her child. She remembered the shame that followed each outburst, the desperate apologies, the cycle repeating itself day after day until she'd finally sought therapy and learned to recognize the signs of her own emotional depletion before it spilled onto her daughter. Anya Sharma wasn't just exhausted. She was drowning in the same sea of maternal guilt and depletion that Elena had once navigated. And Elena had responded not just as a CPS investigator, but as a woman who recognized the reflection of her own past struggle in another mother's eyes. Had that recognition compromised her objectivity? Had she offered the emergency overnight care option not solely because it was the most appropriate intervention for Mateo's safety, but because it was the intervention she herself would have wanted during her darkest days, a lifeline that preserved dignity while providing concrete support? The ethical implications settled heavily on her shoulders. Her job required her to assess risk to children, not to empathize with parental suffering, though the two were often intertwined. But empathy, she knew from hard experience, could be a double-edged sword. It could open doors to genuine connection and sustainable change. Or it could blind her to escalating danger when her desire to see a parent succeed overrode clear evidence that a child was not safe. She started the car and pulled away from the curb, the windshield wipers swishing rhythmically against the rain. She had 3 hours before her next appointment. Enough time to make the referral for Mateo's overnight care placement, to document the visit thoroughly, and to sit with the discomfort of her own uncertainty. Because the truth was, she couldn't know yet whether her decision this morning had set 3 lives on a path toward healing or whether it had merely delayed an inevitable crisis that would require more drastic intervention later. All she could do was proceed with eyes open, heart engaged but not ruling her judgment, and the humility to recognize that sometimes the most compassionate choice in the moment becomes the most harmful one in retrospect. She drove toward the office, the city unfolding around her in shades of gray and green under the gentle rain. Somewhere behind her, in a small apartment with drawn curtains, a mother was packing a small suitcase for her son while he watched silently from his bed, clutching a worn stuffed bear. Somewhere ahead of her, in a brightly lit office with case files stacked neatly on desks, her supervisor would review her documentation and likely approve her intervention plan without question. It was, after all, precisely the kind of supportive approach their agency encouraged. And somewhere in between those 2 points, Elena herself carried the weight of a decision already made but not yet proven wise or foolish, its ultimate impact still unwritten, its moral dimension still shifting like shadows and changing light. This was the reality of her work, not the clear-cut rescues portrayed in television dramas, but the ambiguous terrain where good intentions and imperfect knowledge collided, where every choice carried the potential for both healing and harm, and where the only certainty was that one decision, made on an ordinary rainy Tuesday morning, had already begun changing 3 lives forever, though none of them yet knew in what direction those changes would ultimately lead. Part 2. The first night without Mateo stretched longer than any night Anya could remember. She returned from her overnight shift at 7:15 the next morning to an apartment that felt less like a home and more like a museum exhibit of a life she used to live. A life where small sounds punctuated the silence. The creak of floorboards under light footsteps, the hum of a child singing tunelessly to himself while brushing his teeth, the rustle of covers as he burrowed deeper under blankets during a thunderstorm. Now there was only the refrigerator's mechanical sigh, the distant traffic on the street below, and the oppressive weight of quiet so complete it seemed to press against her eardrums. She stood just inside the doorway for nearly 10 minutes, bag still slung over her shoulder, staring at the empty space where Mateo's shoes should have been lined up neatly by the door, the left one always slightly askew because he hadn't yet mastered the precise angle of placement. She had packed those shoes carefully into his small overnight bag the previous evening, along with 3 changes of clothes, his toothbrush still damp from use, and Mr. Snuggles whose fur had been worn thin in patches from years of anxious stroking. She had kissed his forehead before leaving him at the care home, a converted house in a quiet neighborhood with a wraparound porch and wind chimes that tinkled softly in the evening breeze, and he had clutched her hand until the caregiver, a woman named Rosa with kind eyes and silver streaks in her dark hair, had gently suggested it was time for the other children to arrive and settle in. Mateo had released her hand then, not with resistance but with a quiet resignation that broke something open inside her chest. He had not cried. He had simply turned and walked toward the living room where other children were already assembling puzzles on the carpet, his small shoulders straight, Mr. Snuggles tucked under one arm like a shield. Anya had driven away with her vision blurred by tears she refused to let fall until she was 3 blocks away and certain no one could see her weeping at a red light. Now, standing in the silent apartment, she moved through rooms that felt both familiar and alien. She poured coffee she didn't want to drink. She sat at the small table for 2 and traced the grain of the wood with her finger, remembering how Mateo used to draw pictures on napkins during breakfast, sliding them across the table to her with a shy smile. She had often been too tired to appreciate those small offerings, too focused on the clock ticking toward her departure for work or the mental checklist of tasks awaiting completion. How many of his drawings had she glanced at absently before folding them into her purse to look at later? A later that never came because the drawings were eventually lost in the abyss of her bag's interior, crumpled beyond recognition. She rose abruptly and went to his bedroom, unable to bear the emptiness of the living room any longer. His bed was neatly made. She had made it herself before leaving for work, a pointless gesture of order in a life that felt increasingly chaotic. She sat on the edge of the mattress, the springs groaning under her weight in a way they never did under his. She pressed her face into his pillow, breathing in the fading scent of his shampoo, coconut and something sweet, a fragrance chosen because he'd liked the cartoon monkey on the bottle. The scent was already fading after one night. By tomorrow it would be gone entirely, replaced by the neutral smell of clean cotton. She wondered if he was missing her pillow too, if he was lying in a strange bed in a room with other children breathing softly around him, staring at an unfamiliar ceiling and counting the minutes until morning when she would return for him. She had promised to pick him up at 7:30 sharp. She would be there early. She would be there before he even began to wonder if she was coming. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand where she'd left it charging. A text from Rosa, the caregiver. Mateo settled in well. Ate dinner. Played with trains. Quiet but not withdrawn. Asks about you occasionally. Sleeping now. All is well. Anya read the message 3 times, each word a small anchor in the sea of her anxiety. Settled in well. Not withdrawn. Asks about you. These were good signs. They were exactly what she had hoped for. So why did each phrase feel like a tiny betrayal? Why did the knowledge that he was coping, perhaps even thriving, in her absence twist something painful inside her? She typed a reply with trembling fingers. Thank you for the update. See you tomorrow at 7:30. She almost added I miss him already but deleted the words before sending. That vulnerability felt too dangerous to share with a stranger, even a kind one. Instead she set the phone face down on the bedspread and lay back fully clothed across Mateo's narrow mattress, curling onto her side in the space he usually occupied. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, memories surfaced unbidden. The night Mateo was born, how she had held him for the first time and felt a love so fierce it terrified her with its intensity. The way he used to crawl into her bed during thunderstorms when he was 3, his small body warm against hers, his breathing eventually slowing into the deep rhythm of childhood sleep while she lay awake watching him, marveling at the miracle of his existence. The gradual shift over the past year as her exhaustion deepened and his needs began to feel less like invitations to connection and more like demands she couldn't meet. She remembered the first time she had snapped at him for asking her to read the same book for the 3rd time in one evening. Her voice sharp with a fatigue that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the mountain of medical transcripts waiting on her laptop, the rent due in 5 days, the silence of an apartment where no adult voice ever answered hers except her own. She had seen the confusion in his eyes then, the way his small face had crumpled not with tears but with a dawning understanding that his mother's love had conditions he couldn't control. That moment had haunted her for months. She had apologized later, of course, holding him close and whispering, I'm so sorry, Mommy's just tired, but the damage had been done. Children forgive easily but they forget slowly. They carry the memory of a parent's sharp tone long after the parent has moved on, storing it away as evidence about their own worthiness of love. A sob escaped her throat then, raw and unexpected. She pressed her fist against her mouth to stifle the sound, but another followed, and another, until her body was shaking with grief she hadn't allowed herself to feel while Mateo was present. Grief for the mother she had intended to be, grief for the childhood she was failing to give him, grief for the loneliness that had become her constant companion since Mateo's father had walked out before the pregnancy test had even registered 2 lines. She had told herself she didn't need him. She had built a life on the stubborn conviction that she and Mateo were enough for each other. But the truth was more complicated. They were all each other had, and that reality had become both their salvation and their prison. Without extended family nearby, her parents deceased, her sister living 3 states away with 3 children of her own and little capacity to absorb another dependent, without friends who understood the particular isolation of single motherhood on a transcriptionist's salary, without a partner to share the weight of worry and wonder that comes with raising a human being, she had slowly been crushed beneath the cumulative pressure of being everything to one small person while having no one to be anything to herself. The overnight shifts had seemed like a solution. The higher pay would mean breathing room financially, would mean saving for Mateo's future, would mean not having to choose between groceries and the electric bill. She hadn't anticipated how the inversion of natural rhythms would erode her capacity for patience, how the constant state of low-grade sleep deprivation would make her irritable and hollowed out, how the hours she was present with Mateo would increasingly coincide with her own biological need for rest, creating a tragic misalignment where his need for engagement met her need for stillness, his need for noise met her need for quiet, his need for her met her inability to give. She cried until her throat was raw and her eyes burned. Then she rose from Mateo's bed, washed her face at the sink and made a decision. Not a dramatic one, no grand gestures or life-altering pronouncements, but a small, practical choice that felt, in that moment, like the first authentic act of motherhood she had performed in months. She would not spend this day sleeping as she had planned. She would not collapse into bed the moment her head hit the pillow and lose these precious hours of freedom to unconsciousness. Instead, she would use this time, this strange gift of solitude that felt more like punishment, to prepare for Mateo's return. She would clean the apartment properly, not the surface-level tidying she usually managed between shifts, but a deep cleaning that would scrub away the accumulated grime of exhaustion and neglect. She would go to the grocery store and buy ingredients for his favorite meal, spaghetti with extra garlic bread. She would take down the heavy winter curtains that kept the apartment perpetually dim and let actual sunlight flood the rooms for the first time in months. She would create a home worthy of his return. It was a small thing, perhaps even a futile one in the grand scheme of their challenges, but it was something she could control. And in a life that had felt increasingly beyond her control, that small measure of agency mattered more than she could articulate. She worked steadily through the morning and into the afternoon, moving with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. She scrubbed the kitchen floor on her hands and knees, the physical labor a welcome distraction from the churn of her thoughts. She wiped down baseboards that hadn't seen a cloth in over a year. She sorted through piles of mail accumulated on the counter, recycling junk flyers and filing bills into the shoebox she used as an organizational system. She washed every dish in the sink until the cabinets gleamed. She vacuumed the living room rug so thoroughly that Mateo's faint footprints, barely visible patterns in the pile where he typically sat to watch cartoons, disappeared beneath the machine's suction. With each task completed, she felt a small measure of the weight on her shoulders lift. This was not a solution to their fundamental problems, the financial strain, the scheduling impossibility, the emotional depletion, but it was a declaration. A statement to herself and to the universe that she was still here, still trying, still capable of creating order from chaos even if only within the 4 walls of her apartment. At 4 o'clock she showered and dressed in clean clothes. A soft sweater Mateo had once declared her cozy mommy outfit and jeans without holes in the knees. She left the apartment and walked to the grocery store 6 blocks away, enjoying the simple pleasure of moving through the world without a child's hand to hold, without the mental checklist of snacks and wipes and potential meltdowns that accompanied every public outing with a 7-year-old. She selected tomatoes for sauce from the produce section, running her fingers over their smooth skins. She chose a loaf of Italian bread still warm from the bakery. She picked out a small container of chocolate pudding, Mateo's favorite dessert, and allowed herself a moment of anticipation for the way his eyes would light up when he saw it waiting on the table tomorrow morning. For the first time in months she felt something resembling hope, not the desperate, grasping hope of someone praying for a miracle, but the quiet, practical hope of someone who has identified a small problem within her power to solve and is solving it, one deliberate action at a time. She returned to the apartment with her groceries and began preparing the meal, chopping onions and garlic with a rhythm that felt meditative. The apartment smelled of simmering tomatoes and herbs, a fragrance so ordinary yet so absent from their lives lately that it brought tears to her eyes again, but this time they were different tears. Not tears of despair, but tears of recognition. This was what a home should smell like. This was the sensory backdrop against which childhood memories were formed. The smell of a mother cooking dinner, the sound of her humming softly while she worked, the anticipation of a shared meal at a table where conversation might happen if anyone had the energy for it. She set the table properly, with cloth napkins she hadn't used since Mateo's 6th birthday party and the slightly chipped plates with blue flowers that had been her grandmother's. She placed a single daisy in a small vase at the center. She'd bought it on impulse at the grocery store checkout, drawn to its simple brightness. When the spaghetti was ready, she portioned out a serving onto a plate and covered it with plastic wrap, placing it carefully in the refrigerator with a note taped to the front. For Mateo's breakfast tomorrow. Love, Mommy. She knew he would likely eat the institutional breakfast provided at the care home, but the gesture mattered. The intention mattered. Someone would see that plate waiting for him when he returned and understand that his mother had thought of him during the hours of their separation. Someone, perhaps Mateo himself, would understand that absence did not equal abandonment. She ate her own dinner at the table rather than on the couch with the television on, savoring each bite in the quiet. Afterward, she washed the dishes and wiped down the counters. At 6:30 she sat on the couch and tried to read a novel she'd started months ago but never finished, but the words blurred on the page. Her mind kept drifting to tomorrow morning, to the moment she would see Mateo again, to the expression on his face when he walked through the door and saw the sunlight streaming through the windows, to the way he would run his fingers over the clean surfaces and perhaps, just perhaps, feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the home he returned to each day. Would he notice the difference? Children noticed everything, she knew that. But would he interpret the changes correctly? Would he understand that the clean floors and sunlit rooms were expressions of love, or would he simply absorb the improved environment without connecting it to her effort? The way children naturally accept the conditions of their world as immutable facts rather than as choices made by the adults who shape them? Her phone buzzed again, another text from Rosa. Good day. Mateo made a friend, a boy named Leo who also likes dragons. They drew pictures together after dinner. Mateo showed Leo how to draw fire coming from the dragon's mouth. He smiled when Leo said his dragon was the best. Anya read the message and felt something expand in her chest. Not quite joy, not yet, but the possibility of joy. He had smiled. He had made a friend. He had shared a skill he possessed with another child. These were not just bullet points in a caregiver's report. They were evidence of a spirit beginning to unfurl after a long period of contraction. She typed back, "Thank you for telling me. I'm glad he had a good day." She hesitated, then added, "Did he ask about me again?" She pressed send before she could second-guess the vulnerability of the question. Rosa's reply came quickly, "Yes. Before bed he asked if you would be the one to pick him up in the morning. I told him you absolutely would be." He said good, and held Mr. Snuggles tighter. Anya's breath caught. He had asked. He had needed reassurance. And he had been comforted by the promise of her return. This was the delicate balance she had feared disrupting. The trust between mother and child that could be eroded by absence but apparently, in this case, had withstood one night apart. One night. She reminded herself that this was only night one of a 3-night trial. The real test would come tomorrow night, and the night after that, when the novelty of the care home had worn off and the reality of repeated separation set in. But for now, for this moment, she allowed herself to feel a fragile sense of relief. She had not broken him by sending him away for a night. She had not confirmed his deepest fear, that her love was conditional on his silence, his self-sufficiency, his ability to disappear when she needed rest. He still expected her to return. He still believed in her constancy. She slept that night in her own bed for the first time in months without Mateo curled against her back, a habit he had developed during a bout of nightmares the previous winter and never fully relinquished. The bed felt vast and cold without his small body radiating warmth beside her. She lay awake for hours listening to the unfamiliar silence, her mind racing with scenarios of tomorrow's reunion. What if he was angry with her? What if he had grown attached to Rosa and the other children and didn't want to come home? What if he had realized during these nights away that other homes functioned differently, that other mothers were more present, more patient, more capable, and had begun to resent the limitations of their life together? These fears were irrational, she knew. Rosa had been clear that this was temporary care, not foster placement. Mateo understood the arrangement. But fear rarely bowed to rationality, especially the fears of a mother who had spent years compensating for the absence of a co-parent by trying to be everything to her child, only to discover that being everything was impossible and that her inevitable failures were etching themselves into his psyche in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. She woke at 6:30 after barely 4 hours of fitful sleep, her body operating on the internal clock that had governed her life for years, the clock that knew when to rouse itself regardless of how little rest it had received. She showered quickly, dressed in the same cozy mommy sweater, and checked the apartment one final time. Sunlight streamed through the windows she had cleaned the previous day, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny fairies. The place looked different in this light, not just cleaner but lighter, as if the removal of physical grime had somehow lifted a spiritual weight as well. She packed a small bag with items for Mateo's second night away, a fresh pair of pajamas, his favorite book to be read at bedtime, a drawing he had made last week that she had carefully preserved in a folder rather than losing in her purse, and left the apartment at 7 o'clock, 15 minutes earlier than necessary. The care home was only a 20-minute walk from her apartment, but she had driven the first time in a haze of anxiety and grief. Today she walked, needing the physical movement to calm her nerves. The morning air was crisp with the approach of autumn, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. She passed other parents walking children to school, their hands clasped tightly around small fingers, their voices warm with morning greetings. She felt a pang of envy so sharp it nearly stopped her in her tracks. Not envy of their intact families or their apparent ease, but envy of their simple, uncomplicated presence in their children's mornings. They would return home to empty houses later, yes, but they would have experienced the ritual of breakfast together, the shared walk to school, the goodbye kiss at the classroom door, all the small ceremonies that built the foundation of a child's sense of security. Anya had missed so many of those ceremonies. Her presence in Mateo's life had become increasingly confined to the margins, to exhausted evenings when she had little left to give and early mornings when she was rushing out the door before he had fully woken. She had become a ghost in her own child's life, present in body but absent in spirit, and the recognition of that truth was more painful than any financial struggle or scheduling conflict she had faced. She arrived at the care home at 7:20, 10 minutes early. The house looked even more welcoming in daylight, the white paint fresh, the flower boxes beneath the windows filled with late-blooming marigolds, the porch steps swept clean. She stood on the sidewalk for a full minute, gathering her courage. This should not be difficult. This should be a simple pickup. But it felt momentous, as if the next few minutes would determine whether the fragile trust between her and Mateo could survive this experiment in separation. Rosa opened the door before she could knock, as if she had been watching for her arrival. "Anya," she said warmly, stepping onto the porch. "He's been awake since 6:30. Been watching out the window every few minutes." Anya's heart clenched. "Is he okay?" "He's fine. Quiet this morning, but not in a concerning way. Just thoughtful. Come in." The interior of the house was exactly as she remembered from the previous evening. Warm, slightly cluttered in the way of homes that welcome children, filled with the gentle chaos of toys and books and art supplies. But now it was illuminated by morning light, and the sounds were different. The murmur of adult voices in the kitchen, the laughter of children in another room, the clatter of breakfast dishes being cleared away. It smelled of pancakes and coffee and the faint, clean scent of laundry detergent. It smelled, she realized with a jolt, like the home she had always wanted to provide for Mateo but had never quite managed to create. "He's in the living room," Rosa said softly, gesturing down the hall. "I'll give you a moment." Anya walked slowly toward the open doorway, her footsteps silent on the hardwood floor. And there he was, sitting cross-legged on a rug patterned with bright colors, Mr. Snuggles propped against his thigh, a crayon drawing spread out on the floor in front of him. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable for a long moment. Then his face softened, not into a smile exactly but into something more profound, a relaxation of the tension that had lived in his small features for months. He set down the crayon he was holding and rose to his feet. "Hi, Mommy," he said quietly. "Hi, sweetheart." Her voice cracked on the words. She knelt down, opening her arms, and he walked into them without hesitation, his small body fitting perfectly against hers as he buried his face in her neck. She held him tightly, breathing in the scent of his hair, different from yesterday, washed with a shampoo that wasn't theirs, carrying the faint fragrance of this other home. She felt him trembling slightly, whether from emotion or the early morning chill she couldn't tell. "I made spaghetti last night," she whispered into his ear. "It's in the fridge for your breakfast." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his dark eyes searching her face. "With garlic bread?" "With extra garlic bread. And chocolate pudding for dessert." A tiny smile touched his lips, so fleeting she might have imagined it, but she knew she hadn't. "Okay." She stood, keeping one hand on his shoulder as if afraid he might disappear if she broke physical contact. "Are you ready to go home?" He nodded, then bent to gather his drawing from the floor. He held it out to her, a dragon, more detailed than any he had drawn before, with intricate scales and flames that spiraled from its mouth in shades of blue and purple. In the corner, drawn in careful block letters, were the words, "For Mommy." Her vision blurred. "It's beautiful, Mateo. Thank you." "He drew that after breakfast," Rosa said from the doorway, having reappeared silently. Said he wanted to make something to show you. Anya looked from the drawing to her son's face, seeing not just the child who had survived one night away from her, but the artist he was becoming, the thoughtful boy who processed his world through color and line, the son who still reached for her even after experiencing care from another adult. In that moment the experiment felt justified. Not because it had solved their problems, those remained as formidable as ever, but because it had created space for this small exchange, this gesture of love that might not have occurred in the exhausted rush of their usual mornings. "Thank you for taking such good care of him," she said to Rosa, her voice thick with emotion she no longer tried to hide. "It's my job," Rosa replied with a gentle smile. "But it's also my privilege. He's a good kid. Thoughtful. Creative. He just needs, well, he needs what all kids need. Consistency. Safety. The freedom to be a kid without worrying about grown-up problems." The words landed with the weight of truth. Anya nodded, unable to speak. She took Mateo's hand, his fingers small and warm in hers, and together they walked out of the care home and into the morning light. The walk back to their apartment was quiet, but not the heavy, strained silence that had characterized so many of their recent interactions. This quiet felt different, companionable, peaceful, filled with the unspoken understanding that something had shifted between them overnight. Mateo walked close to her side, his shoulder occasionally brushing against her arm, his grip on her hand firm but not desperate. He pointed out a squirrel darting up a tree trunk, a cloud shaped like a whale, a car with an unusual shade of blue paint, small observations offered not as demands for her attention but as gifts, shared moments of noticing the world together. Anya responded to each one with genuine interest, asking questions, matching his tone of quiet wonder. She felt present in a way she hadn't in months, not performing presence while her mind raced with worries about work and bills and exhaustion, but truly inhabiting the moment with her child. It was a fragile state, she knew. It would likely evaporate the moment she walked into their apartment and faced the reality of needing to sleep before her next shift. But for these 20 minutes walking home in the autumn morning, she allowed herself to believe that change was possible, that the patterns that had trapped them both could be interrupted, that new ways of being together could be forged even within the constraints of their difficult circumstances. When they reached their building, Mateo hesitated at the bottom of the steps leading to their entrance. "Mommy," he said softly, "the windows look different." She followed his gaze upward to their apartment windows on the second floor. Sunlight streamed through the panes she had cleaned the previous day, catching the glass at an angle that made it gleam. "I washed them yesterday," she said, "and I took down the heavy curtains. I thought maybe we could let more light in." He considered this for a moment, then nodded. "I like it." Inside the apartment, his eyes widened as he took in the transformed space, the sunlit rooms, the clean surfaces, the table set with the blue-flowered plates and the single daisy in its vase. He walked slowly through the living room, running his fingers along the mantelpiece she had dusted, peering into the kitchen where the counters sparkled. He paused at the doorway to his bedroom, taking in the neatly made bed, the absence of clutter on the floor, the way the morning light fell across his comforter in a perfect rectangle of gold. "You cleaned?" he said finally, turning to face her. "I did." "Why?" The question was simple, direct, devoid of accusation. It was a genuine inquiry into her motivation, a question no adult would dare ask without layers of subtext, but one a child could pose with pure curiosity. "Because I wanted our home to feel like a happy place when you came back," she answered honestly. "Because I realized I haven't been taking very good care of our space lately. And because I love you, Mateo. And I want you to feel loved when you're here." He absorbed this answer without immediate response, his small face thoughtful. Then he walked to the kitchen table and pointed to the covered plate. "Is that my spaghetti?" "It is. Would you like to eat it now?" He nodded. She served him the reheated pasta, cut the garlic bread into manageable pieces, and placed the chocolate pudding beside his plate. She sat across from him as he ate, watching the way he twirled the spaghetti carefully around his fork, the way he closed his eyes briefly after the first bite as if savoring a rare delicacy. He ate slowly, deliberately, as if the meal itself was a form of communication, a language of care expressed through garlic and tomatoes and the effort of preparation. When he had finished, he pushed his plate away and looked at her directly. "Mommy," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "will I go back tonight?" The question hung between them, delicate as a soap bubble. Anya had known it was coming, had rehearsed her answer a dozen times during her sleepless night, but now that the moment had arrived, all her prepared words evaporated. What remained was only truth. "Yes, sweetheart. For 2 more nights. Remember?" We agreed to try it for 3 nights total. His lower lip trembled almost imperceptibly. I like it there. Rosa is nice. And Leo draws good dragons. Pause. But I miss you at night. The words landed in her chest like a physical blow. I miss you too, she said, her voice breaking. More than I can say. But mommy has to work while other mommies sleep. And when I come home in the morning, I'm so tired that I can't be the mommy you need me to be at night. I fall asleep when I should be reading to you. I get grumpy when you need things from me. That's not your fault. It's not because I don't love you. It's because mommy's body gets very tired from working all night. He considered this explanation with the solemn wisdom of children who have spent their lives deciphering adult emotions. Will you still read me a story before I go? Every night. 2 stories if you want. And you'll pick me up tomorrow morning? Before 7:30. I promise. He nodded slowly, accepting the terms not with resignation but with a dawning understanding that this arrangement, however strange, was born of love rather than rejection. Okay, he said finally. But can I have the dragon drawing back after I show Rosa? It's for you, but I want to show her first. Of course you can show her first. It's your drawing. You can share it with anyone you want. A small smile touched his lips again, more confident this time. Leo will like the blue fire. After breakfast, Anya helped him pack his bag for the second night, adding the fresh pajamas, the favorite book, carefully rolling the dragon drawing to prevent creases. She brushed his hair, noticing how soft it was beneath her fingers, how the morning light caught gold strands she hadn't noticed before. She had spent so much time focused on his needs as obstacles to her own rest that she had forgotten to simply appreciate the physical reality of him. The miracle of his existence, the beauty of his growing body, the privilege of being the person entrusted with his care. At 7:25 they left the apartment together, hand in hand. The walk to the care home felt different this time, not charged with anxiety but settled into a new rhythm, a temporary routine that held within it the seeds of something more permanent. Anya found herself noticing details she had missed the day before, the way Mateo's footsteps matched hers in cadence, the way he squeezed her hand gently when they crossed the street as if to say I'm here with you, the way he chattered softly about the dragon he and Leo might draw together that evening. He was not just enduring this arrangement. He was, in his own quiet way, beginning to thrive within its boundaries. Rosa greeted them at the door with the same warmth as before. Mateo released Anya's hand and walked into the house without looking back, a gesture that should have wounded her but instead filled her with a strange, bittersweet pride. He was learning to trust other adults. He was learning that his mother's love was not diminished by temporary separation. He was learning, in the most fundamental way possible, that the world contained kindness beyond their small apartment, and that he was safe enough to explore it. 2 more nights, Rosa said softly as Anya lingered in the doorway. And then we'll talk about what comes next. Anya nodded. I've been thinking, my sister might be able to come visit next month. She's talked about taking a longer trip to see us. Maybe we could explore whether she could provide some regular support. Not full-time, but perhaps 1 or 2 nights a week. It's worth discussing, Rosa said. Having family involved can make a tremendous difference. But let's get through these 3 nights first. 1 step at a time. 1 step at a time, Anya repeated, the phrase settling into her bones as both mantra and promise. She walked home alone again, but the solitude felt different this time, not empty but full of possibility. She entered the sunlit apartment and stood for a moment in the center of the living room, breathing in the scent of clean floors and fresh air. For the first time in months, the space felt not like a burden to be maintained but like a sanctuary to be cherished. She thought of Mateo at that moment, perhaps drawing with Leo, perhaps listening to Rosa read a story, perhaps simply existing in a space where his needs were anticipated rather than resented, and she felt not guilt but gratitude. Gratitude for Rosa and the care home staff who had created a haven for her son. Gratitude for Elena Vasquez, the CPS investigator whose intervention had felt like judgment in the moment but was revealing itself as mercy in retrospect. Gratitude for her own capacity to change, however slowly, however imperfectly. She lay down on her bed fully clothed, exhaustion finally catching up with her after the emotional intensity of the morning. But as she closed her eyes, she did not fight the sleep that came for her. She welcomed it, knowing that for the next several hours she would rest deeply, without the anxiety of a child needing her in the next room, without the guilt of knowing she was failing him by sleeping when he needed engagement. Tonight she would wake refreshed enough to read him 2 stories before delivering him to Rosa's care. Tomorrow she would do the same. And after 3 nights they would face whatever came next, together but with new tools, new perspectives, and the fragile but genuine hope that one difficult decision, made in a moment of crisis, might ultimately lead them both toward a more sustainable way of being family. She fell asleep with the dragon drawing propped on her nightstand where she could see it the moment she woke, a reminder that even in separation, love found its way through color and line and the simple, profound act of making something beautiful for someone you hold dear. And somewhere across town, in a house filled with the sounds of children laughing and adults speaking gently, Matteo lay on his side in a bed that was not his own, Mr. Snuggles tucked under his chin, dreaming not of darkness or loneliness, but of dragons with blue fire and mothers who always came back. The third night arrived with a quality of anticipation that felt foreign to Anya, a sense not of dread but of purposeful transition. She had slept deeply after returning from dropping Matteo off the previous evening, waking at 3:30 feeling something she hadn't experienced in over a year, a measure of restored capacity. Not complete restoration, that would take months, perhaps years of consistent support and structural change, but enough to notice the difference between functioning from a place of depletion versus operating from a baseline of adequate rest. She moved through her pre-shift routine with a quiet efficiency that left room for small gestures of care, brewing a travel mug of tea to sip during her commute, laying out Matteo's clothes for the following morning with attention to his preferences, the dinosaur socks he loved, the blue shirt without the tag that irritated his neck, writing a note on the kitchen whiteboard in colorful markers, "Love you to the moon and back. See you tomorrow morning, Mommy." These acts were insignificant in isolation, but together they formed a new language of motherhood, one not defined by heroic sacrifice or desperate survival, but by sustainable presence. She had spent years believing that love meant enduring exhaustion without complaint, that good mothering required the complete erasure of her own needs. The past 2 days had begun to teach her a different truth, that love also meant recognizing her limitations honestly and seeking support before crisis forced her hand. That good mothering sometimes looked like accepting help rather than refusing it out of pride. That her son needed not a martyr, but a mother who was well enough to truly see him. At the transcription office, her focus was sharper. She completed her assigned files 20 minutes ahead of schedule, a feat she hadn't accomplished since before Matteo started first grade. During her break, instead of scrolling mindlessly through her phone as she usually did, the digital equivalent of emotional anesthesia, she opened her laptop and did something she had been avoiding for months. She drafted an email to her sister Priya. Not the perfunctory monthly check-in filled with surface-level updates, but a raw, honest letter describing the intervention by Child Protective Services, her shame and fear in that moment, the unexpected gift of the emergency overnight care program, and her dawning realization that she could not continue on her current path without permanent damage to both herself and Matteo. She wrote about her exhaustion not as a personal failing but as a structural reality of single motherhood without support systems. She described Matteo's flinching not as a character flaw but as a trauma response to living with an emotionally unavailable caregiver. And she asked, not for a rescue, not for Priya to abandon her own family and move across the country, but for honest conversation about whether Priya might be able to visit for 2 weeks next month, not as a vacation but as a working visit during which they could explore sustainable childcare arrangements, perhaps even investigate whether Priya's family might be open to Matteo spending summers with them to give Anya breathing room during the most demanding periods of her work schedule. She pressed send before she could edit the vulnerability out of the message, her finger trembling slightly over the trackpad. Then she closed the laptop and returned to her transcription work, her chest feeling both lighter and more exposed, as if she had removed a protective layer she hadn't realized was also suffocating her. Meanwhile, Elena Vasquez sat in her office reviewing case notes from the previous day, her attention repeatedly drifting to the file labeled Sharma, Anya/Matteo, age 7. She had received Rosa's daily updates, brief, professional summaries confirming Matteo's continued adjustment and Anya's consistent participation in the pickup/drop-off routine. The case was, by all objective measures, progressing exactly as she had hoped when she made the decision to offer supportive intervention rather than immediate removal. And yet the disquiet she had felt leaving the apartment on that first rainy morning had not dissipated. If anything, it had deepened into a more specific unease she could now name. She was using this case as a proxy for her own unresolved grief. The parallels between Anya's situation and her own post-divorce struggles with Sophia were too numerous to dismiss as coincidence. Both single mothers. Both working demanding jobs that left them emotionally depleted during the hours their children needed them most. Both carrying the invisible weight of being the sole emotional anchor for a child navigating a fractured family landscape. Both prone to that particular maternal shame, the conviction that their exhaustion made them failures, that their moments of impatience negated their love. Elena had made her intervention decision not just as a professional assessing risk, but as a woman offering the lifeline she herself had needed but never received during her darkest days. And that conflation of professional judgment and personal history troubled her deeply. She rose from her desk and walked to the window overlooking the city street below. Parents walked children to after-school activities, teenagers laughed in clusters on corners, elderly couples moved slowly hand in hand, all these microcosms of family life unfolding without intervention, without oversight, without the constant threat of state intrusion that hung over families like Anya's. She thought about the fundamental injustice of her profession, that poverty and isolation rather than malice or true incapacity, often triggered the most invasive state interventions into family life. Anya Sharma was not neglectful because she lacked love for her son, she was neglectful because she lacked resources, financial resources to afford reliable childcare, social resources to draw on extended family support, emotional resources to sustain herself through the relentless demands of single parenthood. And the system Elena represented was designed to punish the symptom rather than address the cause, to remove children from struggling mothers rather than provide mothers with the support necessary to thrive. She had tried to subvert that pattern in this case by offering the overnight care program. A bandage solution, yes, but one that preserved family unity while addressing immediate safety concerns. But was she truly helping Anya build sustainable capacity, or was she merely creating a temporary reprieve that would collapse the moment the 3-night trial ended and Anya returned to the same impossible circumstances? Her phone buzzed on the desk, a text from her daughter Sophia, now 23 and living in another state. Called to check in but you didn't answer. Everything okay? Love you. Elena's throat tightened. She had missed Sophia's call while immersed in case files, just as she had missed so many moments of her daughter's childhood while immersed in the crises of other people's children. The irony was almost too painful to bear. She had dedicated her life to protecting children from emotionally absent parents while becoming, in her own way, an emotionally absent mother to her own child, not through neglect or lack of love, but through the slow erosion of presence caused by a profession that demanded she pour from an empty cup day after day after day. She typed a reply, sorry, in the middle of a case. Everything's fine. Love you too. She almost added I'll call you tonight but stopped herself. Empty promises had accumulated between them over the years like unpaid debts. Better to underpromise and overdeliver than to continue the pattern of well-intentioned commitments broken by the relentless demands of her work. She returned to Anya's file and made a decision. Not about Mateo's placement, that decision would come after tomorrow's evaluation meeting, but about her own professional boundaries. She would not allow this case to become a vehicle for her own healing. She would not project her relationship with Sophia onto Anya and Mateo. She would assess their progress with clear eyes, recommend whatever intervention truly served Mateo's long-term well-being regardless of how it reflected on her own past choices, and accept that some families could be stabilized with support while others required more drastic measures, and that her personal history with either outcome was irrelevant to her professional duty. It was a vow she had made to herself many times before, only to find the boundaries blurring again when faced with a mother whose struggles mirrored her own. But today the vow felt different, less like a resolution to be broken and more like a necessary recalibration of her entire approach to the work. She was 50 years old. She had 17 years of experience. She was good at her job. But she was also tired, not just physically tired, but soul-tired from carrying the weight of other people's brokenness without adequate support for her own. Perhaps this case was meant not just to change Anya and Mateo's lives, but to change hers as well, to force her to confront the unsustainable nature of her own caregiving, both professionally and personally, before she broke completely. The following morning, Anya woke at 6:30 feeling something approaching peace. Not the frantic, grasping peace of someone clinging to a temporary reprieve, but the quiet peace of someone who had glimpsed a different way of living and was beginning to believe it might be possible to build that life intentionally rather than waiting for crisis to force her hand. She dressed carefully in clothes that made her feel like herself again, not just functional garments for sleeping or working, but the soft green sweater Mateo had always said made her eyes look like happy leaves, the jeans that fit properly rather than the stretched-out ones she'd been wearing for months out of sheer inertia. She packed Mateo's bag for the final night with a sense of ritual rather than dread, folding his pajamas with care, including the book they had read together the previous evening with her promise to finish the final chapter tonight, tucking a small note into the side pocket. Proud of you. Love, Mommy. She had written similar notes before, but they had always carried an undercurrent of apology, as if she needed to compensate for her failures with written affirmations. This note felt different. It was not an apology. It was a simple statement of truth. At the care home, Matteo greeted her with a drawing he had made during the day, a picture of three figures holding hands beneath a sun with a smiling face. In careful printing beneath the image he had written, "Me and Mommy and Rosa." Anya's breath caught. He had included Rosa not as a replacement mother, but as an additional source of care within his expanding understanding of family. This was not disloyalty, it was emotional intelligence, the recognition that love was not a finite resource to be divided among caregivers, but an abundant force that multiplied when shared. She knelt to his level and studied the drawing carefully. "You made Rosa's hair the right color," she observed. "Silver streaks and all." He nodded seriously. "She said I could draw her any color I wanted, but I wanted to make her real." "She'll love it," Anya said, and meant it. There was no jealousy in her heart at this inclusion of another woman in her son's emotional landscape, only gratitude that he was learning to accept kindness from multiple sources, a skill that would serve him well throughout his life. Rosa emerged from the kitchen drying her hands on a towel. "He had a good day," she said, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Finished the puzzle he started yesterday. Helped set the table for dinner without being asked. Asked thoughtful questions about why stars twinkle." She paused, her gaze shifting between Anya and Matteo. "He's settling into himself. It's remarkable to witness." Anya understood the subtext. In the space created by temporary separation from his mother's exhaustion, Matteo was rediscovering parts of himself that had been suppressed by the need to manage her emotional state. He was remembering how to be curious, how to take up space, how to ask for what he needed without fear of burdening the adult he depended on most. This was the gift she had not anticipated when agreeing to the trial. She had expected to gain rest, but she had not expected her son to gain himself. That evening, after her shift ended, Elena arrived at the care home for the scheduled evaluation meeting. She had chosen to conduct it here rather than at Anya's apartment, a deliberate decision to meet this family on neutral ground, to observe their interactions without the environmental triggers of their home space. She found them in the living room, Anya and Matteo curled together on the couch reading the final chapter of his book, Rosa nearby sorting laundry but within earshot if needed. The scene was so ordinary, a mother and child sharing a story before bedtime, and yet to Elena's trained eye, it was extraordinary in its authenticity. Anya's arm was draped loosely around Matteo's shoulders, not rigid with tension or exhaustion, but relaxed in a way that suggested genuine presence. Matteo leaned into her side without the hypervigilance Elena had noted during her initial home visit, the constant monitoring of his mother's mood, the preemptive shrinking in anticipation of her fatigue. Now he simply existed in her presence, safe enough to be absorbed in the story rather than in managing her emotional state. "Ms. Elena," Matteo said when he noticed her standing in the doorway. He didn't flinch or withdraw. He simply marked his page with a finger and offered a small wave. "Hi, Matteo." "Hi, Anya." Elena took a seat in the armchair opposite the couch, positioning herself at an angle that included Rosa in the conversational circle without making her the focus. "How was the third night?" "Good," Matteo said simply, then returned his attention to the book as if her presence required no further adjustment to his evening routine. The casualness of his acceptance was its own form of assessment data. Anya looked up from the page she had been reading aloud. "He's been himself these past 3 days. Not the quiet version he became at home. The real Matteo, the one who asks questions about everything, who draws dragons with complicated backstories, who sometimes talks too much at dinner because he's excited about his day." Her voice caught slightly on the last phrase. "I forgot what that version of him sounded like." Elena nodded, making a mental note not of deficits corrected but of capacities restored. This was the language that mattered, not what had been wrong but what was now possible. "Rosa," Elena said gently, "could you share your observations over these 3 nights?" Rosa set aside the laundry basket and folded her hands in her lap. Matteo arrived the first night carrying a weight much too heavy for his shoulders. By the third night that weight had visibly lifted. He initiated play with other children. He expressed preferences about meals and activities without apology. He asked for help when he needed it, a simple thing but significant for a child who had learned to minimize his needs. Most importantly, he maintained a secure attachment to his mother throughout. "He spoke of you often, Anya. He carried your photo in his pocket. He never once expressed fear that you wouldn't return for him. That's not resilience, it's evidence of a fundamentally secure bond that was temporarily strained by circumstances, not broken by neglect." The distinction was crucial, and Elena heard it clearly. This was not a case of an insecure attachment being repaired, but of a secure attachment being protected from erosion by environmental stressors. The foundation was sound. The structure built upon it had developed cracks under pressure, but those cracks could be sealed with appropriate support rather than requiring demolition and reconstruction. She turned her attention to Anya. "And you? How have these 3 nights been for you?" Anya took a slow breath, her gaze dropping to her hands for a moment before meeting Elena's eyes directly. "I slept. Really slept. For the first time in years, I woke up without that constant hum of anxiety in my chest. The fear that I'd missed something important while I was sleeping, that Matteo needed me and I wasn't there. I had energy in the mornings to be present with him before dropping him off here. I even had a little energy left at the end of my shift to look forward to seeing him rather than dreading the demands of his needs after a long night of work." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I realize now that I wasn't just tired, Elena. I was drowning. And I didn't even know I was underwater because I'd been holding my breath for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe." The metaphor landed with the force of truth. Elena had heard variations of it from countless parents over the years, but coming from Anya, articulated with such clarity after only 3 nights of intervention, it carried particular weight. This wasn't just about sleep deprivation. It was about the slow suffocation of maternal capacity when support systems fail. "What happens after tonight?" Anya asked, the question hanging between them with palpable vulnerability. "The 3 nights are over. Do we just go back to how things were?" Elena had spent the entire day considering this exact question. She had reviewed agency protocols, consulted with her supervisor about available resources, and most importantly, sat with her own discomfort about the blurred lines between professional judgment and personal history. And she had arrived at a decision that honored both her duty to Matteo's safety and her recognition of Anya's genuine capacity for growth. "No," Elena said firmly. "You don't go back to how things were. That's not why we did this, to provide a temporary reprieve before returning to unsustainable patterns." The purpose of these 3 nights was twofold. First, to ensure Matteo's immediate safety during hours when you were unable to provide supervision. Second, to create space for both of you to experience what life could feel like with adequate support, so that we could build toward a more sustainable arrangement moving forward. She leaned forward slightly, her voice softening but her gaze steady. "I'm recommending a 90-day extension of the overnight care placement, with weekly check-ins between you and me to assess progress. During those 90 days, we'll work together to explore longer-term solutions, whether that's your sister providing regular support, investigating subsidized childcare options that accommodate overnight shifts, or even exploring whether your employer might offer schedule flexibility given your consistent work performance." She paused to let the timeline sink in. 90 days isn't forever. But it's long enough to build new habits, to experience consistency, to allow Matteo's nervous system to recalibrate after months of hypervigilance. And it's long enough for you to make decisions from a place of restored capacity rather than desperate exhaustion. Anya's eyes filled with tears, but they were different tears than those she had shed on the first morning. These were tears of relief, of hope, of being truly seen not as a failing mother but as a capable woman temporarily overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. "And after 90 days?" she asked. "After 90 days, we reassess based on concrete evidence of change, not just your word but observable shifts in Matteo's behavior at school, in your ability to maintain consistent routines, in the development of sustainable support systems. If the progress continues, we gradually transition him back to full-time home care with a safety plan in place for nights when you're working. If challenges persist, we adjust the plan accordingly. But the goal has never been to keep Matteo away from you permanently. The goal has always been to ensure he's safe while giving you the support necessary to be the mother you want to be." The words hung in the warm room, simple and profound. This was the heart of ethical child protection work. Not punishment disguised as help, but genuine partnership in family preservation. Not the removal of children from imperfect homes, but the infusion of resources into struggling families until they could stand on their own. Matteo, who had been listening quietly while pretending to examine the illustrations in his book, looked up suddenly. "Ms. Elena?" he said, his voice small but clear. "Yes, Matteo? Will you come back to visit sometimes? After the 90 days? The question struck Elena with unexpected force. He wasn't asking out of fear or insecurity. He was asking because he had experienced her not as a threatening authority figure, but as a consistent adult who had entered their lives with kindness and stayed long enough to witness their growth. He had incorporated her into his expanding circle of trusted adults, a circle that now included Rosa, Leo, and perhaps others yet to come. This was not dependency. It was healthy attachment formation, the understanding that the world contained multiple sources of safety and care. I might, Elena said softly. If that's okay with you and your mom. He considered this seriously, then nodded. It's okay. You can see my new dragon drawings. I'm making a whole book of them now. I'd like that very much, Elena said, and found that she meant it, not as a professional obligation, but as a genuine human connection forged in the quiet space between crisis and healing. After the meeting concluded, Elena walked home through streets bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. She did not drive. She needed the physical movement, the rhythm of footsteps on pavement, the gradual transition from professional space to personal space that walking provided. As she moved through the city, she noticed things she usually missed in the blur of commute: the way sunlight caught the edges of leaves turning crimson and gold, the laughter of children playing in a park, the elderly man feeding pigeons with a tenderness that suggested this was a daily ritual of connection in an otherwise lonely life. She was seeing the world not as a landscape of risk to be assessed and managed, but as a tapestry of human struggle and resilience. A reality she had known intellectually for 17 years but had only today begun to feel in her bones. She arrived at her apartment building and climbed the stairs to her third-floor unit slowly, deliberately. Inside, she did not immediately turn on lights or television. She stood in the center of her living room and simply breathed, taking in the space that had been her sanctuary and her prison for so many years. The place where she had raised Sophia alone after the divorce, where she had graded papers late into the night while her daughter slept down the hall, where she had cried silent tears of exhaustion and loneliness that she had hidden from her child out of misguided belief that maternal strength meant never showing weakness. She walked to the bookshelf and ran her fingers over the spine of a photo album she hadn't opened in years. She pulled it down, carried it to the couch, and began turning pages, images of Sophia at 5, at 10, at 15, each photograph capturing a moment Elena had been physically present for but emotionally absent from, her mind already on the next case file, the next home visit, the next child whose suffering demanded her attention. She reached the final page, a photograph of Sophia's high school graduation, Elena standing beside her daughter in cap and gown, both of them smiling for the camera but Elena's eyes carrying the faint shadow of preoccupation she could now recognize with painful clarity. She had been thinking about a removal case she was preparing for court the following week, even in that moment meant to be purely celebratory. She had missed so much, not the big milestones which she had attended dutifully, but the small, sacred spaces between them. The quiet car rides where Sophia might have shared a worry if her mother had been truly present. The bedtime conversations that could have deepened their bond if Elena hadn't been mentally composing case notes while tucking her daughter in. The simple joy of witnessing her child's ordinary days without the filter of professional hypervigilance that made her see potential. Trauma in every scraped knee and teenage mood swing. She closed the album gently and placed it back on the shelf. Then she picked up her phone and dialed Sophia's number before she could talk herself out of it. Mom? Sophia's voice carried surprise. Elena rarely called during weekday evenings, always claiming work demands made it impossible. I know it's a strange time to call, Elena began, her voice trembling slightly. But I was looking at old photos today and I realized I missed so much of your childhood not because I didn't love you, but because I didn't know how to hold both my work and my motherhood without letting one consume the other. She paused, swallowing hard. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just telling you the truth I've been avoiding for years. And I want you to know that I see it now. I see what I missed. And I'm sorry. Silence stretched across the miles between them, a silence Elena had feared would be filled with anger or dismissal. But when Sophia spoke again, her voice was soft with an understanding that transcended years of accumulated distance. I know you were doing your best, Mom, she said quietly. I always knew you loved me. I wished sometimes that your best didn't have to come at such a cost to you. You looked so tired all the time. I worried about you more than you ever knew. The words unraveled something tight and knotted in Elena's chest. Her daughter had not been keeping score of missed moments. She had been carrying her own worry for her mother, a reversal of the natural order that spoke to the depth of their connection even in its imperfect expression. I'm learning to do better, Elena said, the words feeling both inadequate and essential. Not just for the families I serve but for myself. And for us. I'd like that, Sophia said. I'd like that a lot. They talked for 47 minutes, not about case files or work crises, but about Sophia's new job, her hopes for the future, the book she was reading, the friend she was thinking of visiting next month. Ordinary conversation. The kind of exchange that forms the foundation of relationship when crisis isn't the primary language spoken between two people. When they finally said goodbye, Elena felt a lightness in her chest she hadn't experienced since before her divorce, a sense not of problems solved but of connection restored. The following morning, 90 days after that first rainy visit to Anya's apartment, Elena returned to the care home for the final evaluation meeting. The air had turned crisp with the deepening of autumn, leaves carpeting the sidewalk in shades of crimson and gold. She found Anya and Matteo in the backyard garden, sitting side by side on a bench while Matteo showed his mother a caterpillar he had discovered on a milkweed plant. Anya listened with genuine interest, asking questions about its journey toward becoming a butterfly, her hand resting gently on his back in a gesture of effortless connection. The tension that had once lived in her shoulders, the physical manifestation of constant hypervigilance, had softened. Her posture was relaxed, her breathing deep and unforced. She looked younger than her 34 years, not because the struggle had vanished, but because she was no longer drowning beneath its weight. "Miss Elena." Matteo called out when he spotted her, his face breaking into a smile that reached his eyes, the first full, unguarded smile Elena had seen from him. He hopped off the bench and ran toward her, stopping just short of collision with the polite hesitation of a child who had learned appropriate boundaries with adults. "Look what I found. She's going to be a monarch. Rosa says monarchs migrate all the way to Mexico." "Impressive," Elena said, crouching to his level to examine the tiny creature. "You've become quite the naturalist these past few months." "He has," Anya said, joining them in the garden path. "Among other things." She smiled at Elena, a genuine expression of warmth unclouded by defensiveness or fear. "Thank you for coming." They moved inside to the same living room where their journey had begun, but everything about the space felt different. Not because the room had changed but because the people occupying it had been transformed by 90 days of consistent support, intentional rest, and the slow rebuilding of trust. Rosa joined them briefly to share her observations. Matteo's continued social engagement, his improved sleep patterns, his growing confidence in expressing needs and preferences, before excusing herself to give them privacy for the final assessment. Elena opened her notebook not as a record of deficiencies to be corrected, but as a chronicle of growth to be celebrated. "Let's start with you, Matteo," she said gently. "What has these past 3 months been like for you?" He considered the question seriously, his small face thoughtful. "At first I was scared," he admitted quietly. "But then I liked it here. Rosa makes good pancakes. Leo is my best friend. And Mommy was different when she picked me up in the mornings. Not tired different. Happy different." He looked at his mother then, his expression softening. "I like happy Mommy." Anya's eyes glistened, but she did not look away or minimize his observation. She simply nodded. "I like happy Mommy too, sweetheart." Turns out she was hiding under all that tiredness. Elena turned to Anya. "And for you?" Beyond the obvious benefit of sleep. Anya took a slow breath. "I learned that asking for help isn't failure. That was the biggest lesson. I spent so long believing that needing support meant I was inadequate as a mother. But Priya came to visit last month. She stayed for 10 days and we actually talked about real solutions instead of just exchanging surface-level updates. She's going to fly Matteo out to stay with her family for 2 weeks every summer, and she's exploring whether she can arrange her own work schedule to visit for 1 weekend a month to give me a proper break." She paused, her voice gaining strength. "I also started seeing a therapist through the Employee Assistance Program at work. Just once a week, but it's helping me recognize the patterns of maternal guilt that were making me resent Matteo's needs even though I love him more than anything. And I joined a support group for single mothers that meets virtually on Sunday evenings. I'm not saying everything's perfect now, but I have tools I didn't have before. And I have hope." The word hung in the room with the weight of hard-won truth. Not naive optimism but grounded hope, the kind built on concrete changes rather than wishful thinking. Elena closed her notebook. "Based on everything I've observed over these 90 days, the stability Matteo has experienced, the sustainable support systems you've begun building, the genuine shifts in both your capacities, I'm closing this case today with a safety plan rather than ongoing supervision." She watched Anya's face carefully for the relief she expected to see, but what she witnessed was more complex. A mixture of gratitude, pride, and a flicker of anxiety about navigating independence after months of structured support. "The safety plan is simple," Elena continued. "You'll continue with overnight care 2 nights per week through the winter months, Mondays and Thursdays, to ensure you maintain adequate rest while building new routines. We'll reassess in 6 months. In the meantime, you have my direct number if crisis emerges. Not for minor struggles, that's what your support network is for, but for genuine safety concerns that can't wait for regular business hours." She paused, then added the word she had practiced carefully in the mirror that morning. You've done remarkable work, Anya. Not perfect work, there's no such thing in parenting. But honest, courageous, transformative work. Mateo is safe. You're well. And your family is intact. That's not just a successful case closure. That's a life changed. Tears flowed freely down Anya's cheeks now, but she made no move to wipe them away. She simply let them fall, a release of the shame she had carried for so long, the belief that she was failing her son, the fear that she would lose him to the very system designed to protect him. In this moment she understood what Elena had known from the beginning but had been too exhausted to receive, that Child Protective Services could be not just a threat but a bridge. Not just an intervention, but an invitation to become the parent she had always wanted to be. Mateo, sensing the emotional shift in the room, walked over and stood between his mother and Elena, taking one of each of their hands in his small palms. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, connecting them physically as they had been connected emotionally throughout this journey, a child who had become not just the beneficiary of intervention, but its quiet architect, his resilience and capacity for trust creating the space for two adults to heal alongside him. As Elena prepared to leave, Mateo walked her to the door holding the dragon drawing book he had mentioned months ago, a collection of 27 intricate illustrations, each one more detailed and vibrant than the last. On the final page he had drawn 3 dragons flying together against a sunset sky, their scales shimmering in shades of blue and purple and gold. Beneath the image, in careful block letters, he had written, "For Miss Elena who helped us find our way home." She accepted the gift with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that this was not just a child's artwork but a map of their shared journey, the darkness they had navigated, the fire they had carried through it, the home they had rediscovered not as a physical place but as a state of being where love could breathe again. Walking home that afternoon, Elena felt the weight of 17 years of carrying other people's pain begin to lift from her shoulders. Not all at once, not completely, but enough to notice the difference between bearing witness to suffering and being consumed by it. She had spent her career believing that her value lay in her capacity to endure the unendurable, to absorb trauma without flinching, to give endlessly without replenishment. But Anya and Mateo had taught her a different truth, that sustainable caregiving required boundaries as much as compassion, self-care as much as sacrifice, and the humility to recognize when one's own healing was necessary to truly serve others. She had entered their lives intending to save a child from neglect, and in the process she had been saved herself, from the slow erosion of her own humanity beneath the weight of unprocessed grief and unsustainable giving. That evening she did not open case files or check work emails. Instead, she called Sophia and invited her to visit next month, not for a holiday or special occasion, but simply because she wanted to see her daughter. They made plans to take long walks and cook meals together and talk about nothing important, the ordinary rituals of connection she had denied them both for too long. After hanging up, she sat on her balcony watching the city lights twinkle to life against the deepening twilight, and for the first time in years she felt not the weight of responsibility for all the suffering in the world, but the quiet joy of being exactly where she was meant to be, a woman who had learned, finally, that healing was not a destination to be reached but a practice to be lived, one decision at a time. And in a small apartment 3 miles away, Anya Sharma read 2 bedtime stories to her son by the light of a bedside lamp, her voice steady and warm, her body relaxed against his small frame. When he finally drifted to sleep, she did not immediately rise to tackle the mountain of tasks awaiting her attention. Instead, she sat quietly in the darkness for 10 full minutes, simply watching him breathe, the slow, even rhythm of a child who felt safe enough to surrender completely to sleep. She thought of the long road ahead, the financial struggles that would not magically disappear, the challenges of single parenthood that would continue to test her resilience, the inevitable setbacks that would come with any human endeavor. But she also thought of the caterpillar in the garden, its patient transformation into something capable of flight, its journey toward Mexico not a solitary trek but part of a collective migration spanning generations. She was not alone. She had Rosa's number saved in her phone. She had Priya's promise of regular visits. She had a therapist appointment scheduled for next Tuesday. She had a support group waiting online every Sunday evening. And she had 90 days of evidence that she could, in fact, be both a working mother and a present one, that exhaustion did not have to be her permanent state, that love did not require self-annihilation. Mateo stirred in his sleep, murmuring something unintelligible before settling again, his hand reaching out instinctively to find Mr. Snuggles on the pillow beside him. Anya adjusted the blanket around his shoulders, her touch feather light. She thought of Elena Vasquez, Not as a caseworker who had intervened in their lives, but as a woman who had seen their struggle and responded not with judgment but with imagination, not with punishment but with possibility. One decision. That was all it had taken. One rainy morning decision to offer support rather than removal, to build trust rather than wield authority, to see a mother's exhaustion not as moral failure but as human limitation deserving of compassion. That single choice had not solved all their problems. But it had created the space for solutions to emerge. It had not erased their struggles. But it had transformed their relationship to struggle, from something endured in isolation to something navigated with support. It had not made them perfect, but it had made them whole again. She rose quietly and moved to the living room, where she sat at the small table for two and opened her laptop. She began drafting an email, not to her supervisor requesting schedule changes, though that would come tomorrow, but to the director of the overnight care program, offering her services as a medical transcriptionist to help them secure grant funding for expansion. If this program had saved her family, perhaps it could save others. Perhaps her pain could become purpose. Perhaps the story of her struggle could become a bridge for another mother standing where she had stood 90 days ago, exhausted, ashamed, certain she was failing the one person who depended on her completely. Outside her window, the city hummed with the ordinary music of human lives unfolding, cars passing on wet streets, distant laughter from an open window, the soft chime of wind catching a neighbor's mobile. Inside, Anya Sharma typed with steady hands, her heart full not of certainty but of hope, the quiet, resilient kind that blooms not in the absence of darkness, but precisely because it has known darkness and discovered it does not have the final word. One decision had changed 3 lives forever, not by erasing difficulty, but by revealing that even in the most broken places, connection remains possible. That even in the deepest exhaustion, renewal waits. That even in the most isolated struggle, community can be found. And that sometimes the most profound transformations begin not with dramatic gestures or heroic rescues, but with a single choice to respond to human suffering not with judgment, but with imagination, not with punishment but with possibility, not with the cold calculus of risk assessment, but with the warm, messy, imperfect courage to believe that people can change, and that sometimes, all they need is someone to create the space for that change to unfold.